Today we have Frank Zafiro, and we will be talking about his past books, his latest book to come out, and the issues surrounding it, along with being a crime novelist as a former LEO officer. Hello, and welcome to another Sidebar in the Rights and Wrongs podcast. I have Frank Scalise here, also known as Frank Zafiro, if I'm not mistaken?
Zafiro.
Zafiro, a crime novelist.
Thanks for having me, and I'll apologize right up front for all the sunshine in my face. It's still morning here, where it's evening where you're at, and my office is catching some sun, even though I have the blinds.
But did you want to introduce yourself, Frank?
Oh, yeah, sure. I'm sorry. Yeah, I was a law enforcement officer for 20 years. I was in the Pacific Northwest in Spokane, Washington. Spent half my career as a police officer, detective, corporal, doing the line work, doing the work of policing. And then the second half of my career, I was in leadership roles, which is also the work of policing, but not the street level work. And I retired as a captain in 2013. I've been a writer since I was pretty young, but my first novel was published in 2006. I used the pen name Frank Zafiro for my crime fiction. I've published over 30 novels now. Several of them are in series. One is the River City series, which is a very thinly veiled Spokane. And another one is the Charlie 316 series, which is set in Spokane. And I wrote that with my co-author and friend, also a former police officer, Colin Conway. And that series is a four book arc. The Badge Heavy is number 3. You can see that behind me. The fourth one, Code 4, comes out on November 23rd of this year. And it wraps the series up.
Oh, thank you. So one thing I wanted to ask, I know you've covered a lot on your podcast, which if anyone's not familiar, he's the host of Wrong Place, Right Crime, which is a really great podcast if you want to hear other crime novelist authors. What got you into wanting to write these stories in this way?
You know, I knew I wanted to be a writer since I was pretty young. And early on, I wrote what I was reading, sci-fi, fantasy, maybe some war stuff, and stuff a 10, 12-year-old would write. And I kept writing all through my, younger years. And then I went in the service, and my first short story was published while I was in the military, and it wasn't a crime fiction story at all. And then after I became a police officer, I didn't write creatively for a stretch of several years. Initially, it was because I was learning how to be a police officer. Then once I kind of had my feet about me where that's concerned, I transitioned into being a training officer. So I'd have a recruit with me. I did a lot of writing about the recruit, but, not any creative writing at the time. And then I started getting a new job essentially every year or two. I became a corporal, became a detective, became a sergeant, and had to learn new jobs, new positions. At the same time, I went back to school. I got my undergraduate degree in history, which there's a lot of reading and a lot of writing that goes into that degree. And so I just wasn't writing fiction. I was writing a lot, but I wasn't writing fiction. And so after this 10-year or so gap of not writing crime fiction, when I started writing crime fiction again, which was kind of spurred by when I became friends with my friend Colin Conway. He was rediscovering writing as well. And so we kind of struck up a friendship over that. What came out was crime fiction. And it really shouldn't be a surprise because a lot of writers, they say write what you know, and a lot of writers will write in some way or another about what they're experiencing in life. I mean, you might be reading a sci-fi novel where people are flying a rocket ship to Jupiter, but elements of that story probably live somewhere in the writer's experience, whether that's an interaction between characters or what the issue is that they're trying to explore or whatever. And so what came out was crime fiction and more crime fiction and more crime fiction. And I was excited to write about it. I felt like I could share aspects of the police officer's experience, that maybe didn't get shared in some of the contemporary fiction or televisions or movies, some of the stereotypes that were out there, trying to maybe clear some of those up. And so especially in River City, my first series, That's up to 6 books now. You know, the cops are the good guys. They're flawed. They fail. They make mistakes. Some of them are I don't know if I should swear or not, but some of them are jerks. You know, but they're the heroes of the story. And as that series has progressed, it's a kind of an ensemble cast sort of thing. One character, Officer Katie McLeod, she has sort of emerged as the core of the series. And so if I had to pick a leading star, she would be that character. But it is an ensemble cast, and you get to see policing through different eyes and realities that maybe some people, they didn't realize that, or they didn't think about it in that way, or they weren't aware that that's the kind of thing cops actually deal with or go through.
I'm trying to get through your first book at the moment and listen to an audiobook, which is Under a Raging Moon. And I do love the fact how it's not under one perspective. I'm waiting to see if you ever put it through the perspective of the lieutenant, the jerk lieutenant, but I'm not sure if you do.
Yeah, actually, that's a great question. So you're talking about Lieutenant Alan Hart, who is, he's the day shift lieutenant in that book. And he was, when at the time that I wrote it, he became the exemplary of, or he came to exemplify that out of touch brass sort of character. And while that's a stereotype, it's a stereotype because it's real. Some people, they promote and they lose touch with the reality of the policing that's taking place on the ground. Now, they also gain some perspective, and that's different. If you can keep grounded and gain perspective and merge the two, you're in great shape. And you can help the people who are on the ground maybe experience some of that perspective that you have gained. But some people, they get ivory tower disease and they forget what it's like to be a cop. And actually, it's very, very common. That's a very, very common complaint among police officers, and I think a valid one. And so Lieutenant Hart is the absolute epitome of that. And then he's also a self-serving, self-centered jerk. So that just makes him the worst.
Strangely, he's one of my favorite characters.
Oh my God. Well, I don't know what that says about you, George.
No, but the reason I like him so much is I think he's a jerk too, but I do think it's very important to have him as a character, though, because I grew up. My mom's a huge crime fiction reader, so I've grew up reading like a lot of the stuff. But he does bring in the voice of, like, what we were talking about on the first episode I ever had you on, where you had the people's voice coming in, like people wanting to change. And like, he kind of reminds me of that voice coming through down from the brass. And like, even though like the old officers like Chisel and Winter and all that stuff, yeah, they have that, but I think it's really important for like people that have that annoying voice of the academic, for lack of a better word.
He's a little bit, like, if you read that series, that I wrote that series pretty much exclusively for the first 4 or 5 years I was writing. I mean, I did short stories too, but those were the only books I was writing. And so you will see, I think, a real leap from the first book to the second book in terms of my craft as a writer. And then again, from the second to the third. And then, I hope that continues in all the books that you read, if you read them in order. But I think the upward trajectory kind of isn't as sharp. And some of the things about that first book that I wouldn't say I'm embarrassed about at all, because I love that book. I'm proud of that book, but it does sort of reveal the biases of the man that wrote that, because I actually wrote the first draft in 1995 after I'd kind of got my feet under me as a cop before I became a field training officer. There's a little window there, and I wrote a draft of it. It was pretty horrible, and I had to do a lot to it when I pulled it back out in 2005, 10 years later. But the bones of that first draft, I still see them even in the version that you're listening to. They're still there. And certainly the biases of the 1995 me as a 2-year police officer saw things. And so Hart was, almost a caricature to a degree. I mean, I think I stopped short of that, but he certainly was in danger of that. And as the series has progressed, I won't give you any spoilers since you enjoy the character, but he remains the same. But one of the things I've tried to do in the more recent titles is to present a little bit more of a balanced view of him, because nobody is bad all the time. Nobody is 100% bad. And so in the latest book, he makes a few points that are 100% completely accurate. And he's right. Things should have been done this way. Things should proceed this way. And he gets kind of poo-pooed by the cool kids that in the story. And, they're wrong and he's right. And that, I think, adds that kind of a thing sort of adds to the complexity of the character. And that's important, because otherwise they become, like I said, caricatures, or they become cardboard, or they become one-note Nellies.
I'm enjoying them because it's something I've rarely ever seen in other novels. Like, I'm sure you've read more than I have, but mainly you have that one captain that's like, he's upset that they're doing it like professionally, but in the back he's like, yeah, that's my boy kind of thing. Yeah. But he's just, and I kind of like the fact because he doesn't care. He really does. He's a very, like, you can hate me, I don't care. And it's a very realistic.
He only cares about his own career, right?
Yeah. And it's very real.
And he really doesn't like cops. I've come to the conclusion that he doesn't, or maybe not that he doesn't like cops. I don't think Lieutenant Alan Hart believes in cops very much. He has a very low opinion of them. And that becomes very clear as the series progresses. He remains a secondary or even tertiary character, but he's still there in book 6, which is just came out this year, Place of Wrath and Tears. So that character still is around.
But I also wanted to get into you have a new book coming out next month.
The 23rd of November.
And that is, I only read a brief description. Sorry, I just can't read all of your books within
a span of a week.
This is the one with, I'm assuming he is a Black American cop that gets...
Yeah. What happens, it's the Charlie 316 series, and it starts with Charlie 316 as the first book. And what happened there was my friend Colin, who I've had a friendship and a writing relationship with, over the last 15 years or so at least. He got in touch with me and he said, hey, I have this idea for a book that I'm really excited about. And there's some very, I think, timely elements to it, but it's going to be a procedural. And I'm worried I might get over my skis a little bit on some of the aspects of it that I had nothing to do with when I was a cop. And what he's referring to more is my experience in the leadership role, from sergeant up to, I was a major until they eliminated that rank for a while, but to the captain role and how things would happen from that perspective. And he said, we had written a book before together. We had collaborated on a book called Some Degree of Murder, which is set in my River City universe. And so he knew we could work together, and so he proposed this. And so the premise is that a model police officer, Tyler Garrett, and he's a model officer in that he's a former SWAT officer. He's a hard charger. He's a hard worker. He's a handsome family man who is respected within the department and within the community, a golden child, right? For all the right reasons. He makes a traffic stop and he is Black, which is a very small percentage in Spokane, Washington. Sub 5% easily. Yeah. I can't remember what it was. I think it was 2 something, but it's very low.
I think he even said that because he's a Black officer, they hold him even higher regard on the.
Yeah, they certainly get mileage out of that when they put him forward. They get diversity credit for that, and not that they don't mean it when they say it, but the fact that he's there and he's a super cop and he happens to be Black, that's just one more good thing when it comes to the PR point. So he's on patrol one night. He makes a traffic stop on a driver who jumps out and is immediately aggressive, yelling at him, won't listen to him. This happens in chapter 1, so no big spoilers here. And then shots ring out. And he's actually getting shot at from a house across the street, an abandoned house across the street from where the traffic stop happens. The driver makes a move. He perceives a threat. He's in the middle of a firefight. He shoots the driver of the other vehicle, ends up going to the house, charging the house where the other shooters are, only to find the house now empty. And as he goes out the back door to the alley, he sees a pair of taillights going away. And this all happened like this. He's in a shooting. Well, things go south for him pretty quickly because the driver, who's white, which is 90+% of people in the city, he's shot in the back, and there's no gun on the scene, no weapon. So now it's, a questionable shooting, clearly. Now, are there reasons why a suspect might be shot in the back? Legitimate tactical reasons why that could happen? Absolutely. I mean, all you have to think about is action versus reaction. If I point a gun at you and you decide to shoot me, and then I turn around, by the time you've already pulled that trigger, getting ready to pull that trigger, by the time that all occurs, I could be in a position where
You've also got like military training. Like if I ever, like when I shoot, like most people find it strange because I don't think anyone really ever stands square a lot of times when they're doing things. They're always kind of more tilted, especially with rifles or depending. Like you can still hit in the back. So I get that.
Yeah, I mean, it's bad. It looks bad. It could be bad, but it is not automatically bad. There is a reasonable explanation for it. But now there's no gun either. And so the whole story is about that process and what it does to the community, what it does to Garrett, what it does to the officers investigating it, what it does to at the city level, the mayor's office, the police department command structure. And so you get these multiple viewpoints as things are happening. And the question really comes, will they stand behind Garrett, or will they sacrifice their favorite son, on the political altar, right? And that's actually where Charlie 3:16 comes from. For Colin, it was a little bit reminiscent of the John 3:16 Bible verse. And so that's how that entire book goes. I don't want to give out any spoilers. It's a fun read. It's a fast read. And I don't think people will expect a couple of twists and turns that occur. The rest of the series is based around those twists and turns that occur and about resolving what happens at the end of Charlie 3:16. But along the way, and so there's a lot of action, there's a lot of tension, there's a lot of character work going on. And I don't want to spoil any of it, so I won't get into specifics, but I will say that along the way, we also explore things that are very timely and very relevant today. And that is, the whole idea of noble cause corruption, which, if people aren't aware of what that is, it's essentially, and it applies to anybody in any profession or any walk of life, but in the police setting, the idea is it's doing the wrong thing for the right reasons, right? And so how it manifests itself in police work, one way might be, I forgot to read this guy his rights and he confessed, and now it's not admissible, so I say I read him his rights. Or he's running and he throws the gun, and then I tackle him a few feet later, and I'm in a jurisdiction where having the gun on him is important to the case, so he never threw the gun. I put the gun back on him. It's that kind of thing. And or you just even smaller things that are technically corrupt. I don't think anybody would argue, but this guy is a child molester, or this guy is a drug dealer with 5 convictions, or this guy just beat up his wife and his kid. Like, there's no doubt as to his guilt, and he's going to get off if I don't do this. So it's the right thing to do, and I do it, right? And that's how it starts. No corrupt cop, if they're, which is a very minute number. Let's be clear on that. But no police corruption ever started like right below the level that it ended up at. It started with something like what I just described. And then
I guess that's the old homage, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Absolutely. It's that old slippery slope discussion, because then, where does it stop and when does it become wrong? And so, or when does it become doing the wrong thing for the wrong reason, rather than doing the wrong thing for the right reason? And that's how you get in real life. You've seen people go from, making sure this, real bad guy who really definitely did this goes to jail with just a little small white lie. That's how they're justifying it in their mind, to people robbing drug dealers and pocketing the money and so forth. Rampart and the Chicago SOS and these other high profile corruption events that occurred mostly started in this type of a way. We're here trying to do the right thing, and we're doing what we're doing the right way, and then we just need to nudge it once a little here and there. And, hey, the right outcome happened, everything's fine. That's the justification that goes through the mind. But the reality is this was wrong. Whatever you just did, if it wasn't the right thing, then it was wrong, period. And in this series, nobody virtually no one, I guess there is one person that you could point to, one character, no one gets off clean. Everybody's gray. Like everybody has some form of corruption to some level. Now, where they are on that spectrum differs wildly. Why they're there on that spectrum, what put them there, what their purpose is, how they justify what they're doing is different. But, we've created a universe, if you will, where, nobody's entirely clean. Everybody's got a little dirt on them. Not all that dirt is corruption. Some of that dirt is just dirt, but some of it's, corruption, and it has a consequence, and people have to live with those consequences, and it affects more than just the person that's doing it.
No, I think that's what makes it so real. I'm going to be interested when I read the series. I'm definitely going to, how you also play around with the idea of, I never want to say light racism because racism's racism no matter what. But like, I know from serving in the military, and I'm sure when you serve in the military, people think like, oh, the military and the police, that like these are like places that racism does not survive. Like it survives. It's just very skirted comments left and right that you don't really catch. And like the fact that like I heard some straight up like crazy things and just didn't say anything and like walked away, like that's my filth on the matter because I didn't say anything. Where it's supposed to be not zero tolerance in the Marine Corps, but I'm just like a private at the time. That guy is a staff sergeant or whatever. Like I don't want to brush
There's
it.
a power dynamic there.
Yeah, and like and it's going to be very interesting to go through that. When you first started writing this, were you paying attention to like a lot of what's going on right now with the BLM?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we wrote this. Let's see, this is 2020, and the book came out in 2019, in June of 2019. And so we wrote it earlier that year. It's published by Down Out Books, and they're a smaller publisher, so turnaround time wasn't quite as much. So once we finished it, it was able to get published that same year. Wow. And, one of the things that Colin brought up when he brought this idea, because he brought the idea, like the bones of the idea were there. He already had it. We tweaked some things. We worked on some things together, and it was very much a true collaboration, but the seeds of it definitely were wholly his. But one of the things he wanted to do was by making Garrett the shooting officer Black, making him an African-American, and having the motorist, the victim, the suspect, whatever you want to call him, white. It sort of flips the script on what you generally see in the media in real life, which is the opposite usually. Now, it made perfect sense in Spokane because of the demographics. If you had a Black officer who shot somebody, the odds were very good that somebody would be white. But the hope was that by flipping the script a little bit, that it would just cause people to pause just momentarily and maybe have a little bit more honest conversation about it, rather than immediately jumping to the entrenched positions that they already have because they've seen this before, right? Well, you haven't seen it exactly like this, so maybe it gives you pause. And some of the issues that come up in the book within the community are also a little bit flipped around, because now you've got different groups that feel like they have something to say. Whether they're right or not is another matter. But it just by changing up the script a little bit, it hopefully when somebody reads it, they enjoy, a police procedural with a lot of action and suspense. But underneath that, hopefully also it makes them think a little bit about the topic that we're talking about. And because it is different than the way it's presented in real life most of the time, maybe that gives them a little bit of pause and causes them to reevaluate how they might feel about it or what they think about it. And maybe that'll help them get closer to a more realistic understanding of the entire subject, which, we could all do with a little bit of that.
Well, I think that's a really good important thing to look at, is that you're not flipping the script to say, just because you're like, see, it can happen to anyone, because some people might try and make that argument. They're like, yeah, see, it happens no matter what. Like, here's an example. You're doing it because you want people to actually look down at the details, see the flaws, because there's flaws in policing. We've gone over that before. And a lot of the cases of the shootings that have been happening across the issues are fundamental flaws in law enforcement. Racism does play a part, but it doesn't always play as much of a part as always pushed. But it is there.
I would argue that one of the reasons there are flaws in law enforcement is because there are human beings in law enforcement. So of course you're going to have flaws. And while I don't doubt, just like in the rest of society, there are some overt racists who wear a badge. That is such a small number of people in my experience, or to my knowledge. But that doesn't discount the implicit racism that exists, that we as individuals may not even be entirely aware that we harbor. And it's a difficult thing to look at yourself and go, wow, why did I think that immediately? Why did I react that way immediately? Why do I expect this right away? Examining your own potentially implicit racism, which, I mean, it doesn't make you a bad person if that pops up. I mean, any implicit bias, regardless of whether it's towards race or towards a profession or towards anything, is the product of our entire life experience, not just the things we've done and what people have said to us, but the media that we've consumed, the culture that we are part of. And so it's almost like it's, secretly planted seeds underneath our sidewalk of our consciousness. And you might not know those weeds are there, but when they crop up through the crack in the sidewalk and you identify them, that's when you have to be honest about it. Oh, that's a bias that I have. I actually think that way about Native Americans. I didn't even realize I thought that. I didn't realize I had that bias. So let me pluck that weed, examine it, understand it, and then it won't grow anymore. But you got to be honest about it. It's there. And everybody has implicit biases. It's part of the human experience.
I think that's one thing when you're here living in Scotland I found very interesting. One I love because people actually know how to spell my last name. They don't drop the E. But the other thing I've noticed is I put a Scally cap on. I've got rid of my baseball cap. If I don't speak and I just hand people my IDs and stuff, I have the most English name you can come across, George Thomas Oakes. It's just as English as thing. People will come up to me and they just never assume I'm an American. They never assume I've also have very French features. I've had people come up and speak French to me and down the street. I'm like, I don't speak French. I barely speak English. But it is a very interesting thing where in that way, racism works in my favor here because they just assume I am one. And I think that's really important stuff where we have to become aware, as you said.
Yeah. Well, there's a character in the book that kind of experiences that or addresses that. Whenever there's a police shooting, at least in your more progressive agencies, I don't know if some people don't do this. I don't know why they wouldn't. If your agency has a shooting, there is a sister agency that does the investigation for transparency, for a lack of, for conflict avoidance, so you don't have a conflict of interest, and so forth. That's just a good way. It's a professional way to do business. They've been doing it that way in Spokane for a long time. They've been doing it across the country. I think it's the right way to go, no matter how big you are. And at the same time, though, so this sister agency comes in with a couple of detectives, say, to investigate the shooting. The host agency, the home agency, whichever the agency that the shooting officer belongs to, they will assign a shadow, which is one of their own detectives who will shadow that investigation. And their role really is just to make sure that their member, that everything is done to thoroughly investigate this so that their member gets a fair shake, to make sure that this investigative avenue is explored and this witness is interviewed and this evidence is collected, all of that sort of thing. They're kind of almost like an auditor to that investigation. And their purpose is the same as the primary investigators, to find the truth. They're there on behalf of the home agency to make sure that every rock is turned over, and these other investigators do a good job. So in the book, Tyler Garrett is the shooting officer. The county comes in with a couple of detectives who get assigned. The politics start right away because the chief of police assigns as the shadow, not the person who's next up on the rotation who would have naturally got it, but he assigns a detective named Wardell Clint. And the reason that they assign Clint is because Clint is one of the few Black detectives, and he's the only Black homicide detective on the department. So it's good for the optics. And he flat out says that to his captain. We need good optics on this, because he recognizes Black cop shoots white guy in a 95% white community. We need good optics on that. That's his takeaway. So Wardell Clint is a true believer. He's a true believer in the truth. And he's got his issues too. He's a little bit of a paranoid guy. He believes in a lot of conspiracy theories, and he's very smart. He's a very good detective. He might very well be the best detective on the department. And some people have argued he might be somewhere on the spectrum because he's very blunt. He doesn't really care what you think of him. He's a lot like the lieutenant in that regard that you mentioned earlier. He tells it like it is. All you need to know about Clint, I guess, is his nickname is Honey Badger. So
Gotcha.
it tells you what you need to know about Clint. Well, Clint's black. He's very aware of his race. He's very aware of his race within the confines of Spokane and with the demographics in Spokane. And he describes what you're talking about, that implicit racism that takes place, whether it works for you or against you, it's there. He says, he talks about not really seeing a lot of overt racism these days, even in Spokane with that demographic. But he does see, he doesn't really say it's implicit racism, but he calls it ninja racism, almost like passive aggressive racism, where people will just do little things or make little comments that you can't really call them on, but it's there. That's sort of how he describes it. And so he recognizes that there's implicit bias that exists. Of course, he has his own implicit bias, right? Because he's not a perfect person either. And that's what we try to explore in this series a lot, is just how every person within it is a flawed person in some way. And how do they respond to the stimuli in front of them? And why do they respond the way that they respond? We try to do that in a fairly realistic way, even though it is fiction and everything is amped up to, the Spinal Tap 11. It's turned up to that. But
no one wants to read academia.
But it does have that basis, hopefully, in reality. It's a very, it's a procedural. It's not a over the top thriller. It's meant to be grounded in that way.
Yeah, and that's really good to also look at implicit racism, because even though it's not as forward and in your face about it, it can be just as damaging. I kind of went over this on the episode with feminism about how being a man, I never realized the world was built for men. I talked about my time in the Marine Corps where we got new flak vests, new vests, and had a nice cummerbund that put weight around my one waist. As a guy, I'm this is kind of nice because I don't have all the weight on my shoulders. But then you instantly realize a lot of the female Marines that used to have trouble with the old all the weight on the shoulder thing, they're a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
I'm because this is actually built for them.
Mm-hmm.
We all the older equipment, the rifles are huge. I don't mind an M16. I'm 6 foot tall. I don't need an M4. I find the M4 annoying, an oversized pistol. But then it's just the M16. Right. Even some of my smaller male Marines would have trouble with the giant M16 because it's as tall as they are. And you don't realize that the world's built. And even though there's these small little things that people wouldn't think that matter, they build up and they cause problems. 2 questions though. The first off is you talk about, I really did like that, how you talk about having a sister agency do the investigation. I know Massachusetts, it's now policy that if anything happens in any police department, the state police investigate for any local. And if anything happens with the state, it becomes the feds that look into it as their policy. How do you feel about internal investigations? Because I know the bigger departments have them. Do you think that they have a place or that they should be?
Yeah, I do. And it depends on, it would depend on the severity of the charge, right? In a shooting, it's that shooting death is a homicide by definition. A man or a woman took the life of another man or a woman, right? A human being killed another human being. That's a homicide. Now, whether it's justifiable homicide, whether it's criminal homicide, whether it's accidental, these are the things that we will learn in the investigation. That's a life has been lost. That's a pretty serious investigation. I think you probably should be investigating that transparently and with a sister agency. But, for lesser offenses that are alleged, I have found, and I don't know how it is at other agencies because I didn't live there, but in our own department, the internal investigation process was more than sufficient to handle demeanor complaints on up, right? And part of the reason for that was that they had their own investigators. At my agency, it was a sergeant and a lieutenant, so there was some positional authority to go along, or some organizational authority to go along with the positional authority of internal affairs. And once the investigations were very thorough, I read a bunch of them in my leadership role because they needed to be reviewed and signed off on with recommendations and so forth. Once that investigation was completed and the situation was resolved in whatever way it was resolved, those files were public record. So you could go down to the police department and find out what happened when, that guy at the grocery store complained that I was a jerk when I was going through the line buying my soda on a break. they got investigated and found out that, yeah, I was a jerk, and I got a letter of reprimand, and here's the transcript of my interview. Here's the report that they did for, and I know it's going to sound ridiculous to some agencies because they're like, demeanor complaint, what's that? But, if you have a transparent process, it doesn't necessarily have to be transparent while it's ongoing, because there are always going to be some privacy issues that crop up that you have to deal with before making it public, out of fairness to witnesses and frankly to the officer as well. But if you make it public and people look at it and they go, yeah, there's nothing I would have done differently, then of course you could do it yourself. I don't really have a big issue with that, as you could probably tell. I know there's a call for it by some people. Some people want to have civilians oversight do internal investigations. I'm not necessarily entirely opposed to that in as a concept, but it is important to have perspective and to have and so when this sergeant or lieutenant in internal affairs is investigating what occurred, they do so having a real strong contextual understanding of the police environment, police procedures, why that cop may have done it that way, even though the person didn't like it. This is the policy. This is why we do it this way. And if you're going to have civilians do that, then there needs to be an education process, I think, at the very least.
One other big question I have for the book is, since it is an African-American officer, I don't know anything about your co-writer, Colin. Did you interview and talk to any officers of...
No, that's an interesting question, because Colin...
I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Not at all. It was something that we talked about, he and I. Demographically, he's very similar to me. Same age bracket, same race, same gender.
Same pigment color.
Yeah, all of that. And we were actually, as we were writing it, we asked that question, hey, we're, two middle-aged white guys, and our lead character and our second lead character, the detective, are both Black. And especially when we were writing the second book and the third and the fourth, the world that we were living in, there's a big call within writing in general and crime fiction as well, the own voices movement, so to speak, saying, hey, you let people tell their own story. And I agree with that. But there's a lot of, as a writer, I think what you get at the most with characters tends to be their universality, their human experience. And while there are specific elements of that are going to be very different for somebody who's in a different situation or has a different background or different skin color or different religion or whatever, those differences are the minority of the character versus the majority of the character, because they're human and so are you. And quite frankly, if I don't write about people different than me, then every book I write is going to be an autobiography, and who wants to read that? I write, probably the character that I enjoy writing the most in my River City series is Katie McLeod, and she's a female character. And the women, especially the women that I've worked with, police officers, and that have read that character, say it's very, very true to their experience. It's on the nose.
When I remember reading from the first thing about Katie McLeod, when she goes in there buying the Pepsi in that scene, you go right into the fact that people they see her as a woman first, officer second, which I think is a very interesting...
Which is the reverse of what the male counterparts are seeing as, right? Yeah. And that's a good example is, to say that Katie's experience isn't different than Thomas Chisholm's experience is simply not real. It's not reality. And to say Tyler Garrett's experience as a Black man and a Black police officer in a predominantly white city is the same as Ray Zielinski, a white officer, is also a falsehood. And I'm not going to tell lies. I mean, I'm telling lies. I'm writing fiction, but I'm not going to lie within my fiction, right? And so I think you just have to do the very best job you can of understanding as much as you can about those differences, and then trying to present them in a way that's true to those differences, but also true to the universal element of it. And I really tried to do that with Katie, and we've tried to do that with Garrett and with Clint in a way that rings true.
I think one of your guests actually said it best. I can't remember. I think it was your 89th episode. So recently you said when you're writing a woman, you're trying not to write a man in drag. You're trying to
Mm-hmm.
write a woman. I can't
Well,
remember
and
that.
yeah, I think it was Eric Van Lustbader that
Yes,
said
that was him.
that. And that's a sentiment that has really been out there for a long time, that a lot of male authors, they'll write a female author that's really just a dude in pumps, right? And that's, and I very much tried to avoid that. I mean, a lot of my characters are white characters because I'm writing in Spokane and a lot of people are white there. But when I try to write somebody who's the more different they are from me, the more I try to explore those differences and hopefully represent them in a way that's realistic. I used to say, look, a lot of people in this world have the luxury of living in the bubble of their existence and making the world be whatever they want it to be within that bubble. And most of the time their bubble remains intact, and they may go through their entire life with their bubble intact. And that's wonderful. In fact, that's why the military and that's why police exist in one sense, is to allow them that luxury to live within that bubble. But cops, firefighters to a lesser degree, ER nurses and doctors, most certainly, and multiple other professions like this, they have to live in the world the way that it is. They don't get to have that bubble. They have to just deal with reality. So I could have written a River City series where Katie McLeod is, as strong as the strongest cop on the department and as smart as the smartest cop on the department. And nobody treats her different because she's a woman and she, everything's the same as her male counterparts. But that would be ridiculous because it's not.
It's also probably already been written.
Yeah, because then she's a dude in pumps. She's a guy in drag, or whatever you want to say. I was far more interested in a more true to life experience. Is how is it different and this was set in the 90s, is where the series begins. But how different was it for a female officer versus a male officer in the same situation in the 1990s and into the 2000s? How is it the same? How are those differences compensated for? What did Katie do differently that maybe Thomas Chisholm might do another way because he's a male officer, or because he's an older officer, or because he was in the military and she went a different route? How are those different? And we brought some of that same mentality to the Charlie 316 series. How does Garrett live differently or have to compensate or adjust because he's seen maybe as a black man who's a police officer in that exact order versus a police officer who's a man that happens to be black? It's a very different, reaction there. And so we try to explore that.
Well, that's what I've been really enjoying about your writing so far, is also when you did something that I was hoping you'd do, and I was very pleasantly surprised when you did, when you showed through the perspective of the quote-unquote criminal, the villain of it. And I love how you go, no criminal sees themselves as a criminal.
Yeah, and better put, it's been better put as nobody sees themselves as a villain, or everyone is the hero of their own story.
Yeah,
and that includes your villain. Everybody's the hero of their own story, and so you have to. That's the first step, I think, towards writing a compelling villain. If you're going to get in the villain's head, they don't see themselves as a villain unless it's a James Bond novel or something. They're the hero of their own story. Everybody is. And
that's one reason I think this is one thing I find kind of sad, though, and I also do understand it. Many people my generation don't really read crime novels. I more got into it because, strangely, like, my mom's always been into it. And even then, I never read it because it was like, that was the book. Those are the books my mom reads. It was the first crime novel I ever read was actually Early Autumn by Robert B. Parker, one of his old Spencer novels. Because I was forced to in elementary school, not elementary school, I think high school, I was forced to read it. And then when I was in Afghanistan, I was getting homesick. My parents started sending me books. Mom sent me The Maltese Falcon and a bunch of Robert. And I got lost in those books because it reminded me of home, if that sounds any weird.
Not at all weird.
And I enjoyed it. But those are very much, I love his books, but they're very much him. You can tell Parker's putting himself into it. Like, it's his own fantasy. And I love his fantasy, but it's a lot like that. And that's one thing I want any listener that hasn't read novels, because our generation doesn't read crime novels. This, from what I've been reading from your writing, it's a really good start because it's very real. It talks a lot about the subjects, and I'm sure the Charlie 16 series is on the same way. But did you have any suggestions for books other than your own that you might suggest, like, a new novice reader to get into?
Yeah, well, my co-author, Colin Conway, writes a great series called the 509 series. It's an ensemble cast as well, but he does something pretty cool whereas with my ensemble books, you get all these viewpoints in one book, and they'll jump from character to character as the book progresses. And there may be a main character that you get more of, but it jumps around. What he's done is he's got this cast of characters, but each book has a lead character, and you stick with their POV for the most part.
That's interesting.
And some of them are in the first person. I went here, I did this. Some are in the third person. George went and did this. And so, in one book, the character might be the lead. In another book, they have a cameo. In another book, they're secondary. And then maybe they're the lead again in the next book. And so you get to know these characters differently. And it's kind of cool because, in one book, one character might look over at someone and have opinion that guy's a dirty cop, or that guy, flirts with the edge of what's ethical. And then you read another book and somebody says the same thing but has a different view of it. And then you get a book where that character is the main character. And then you get a very clear picture of who they are and where they are on that line. And I just finished reading and critiquing his most recent one, which revisits one of the earlier characters as the primary character again, right on the heels of having read this character who's kind of a not quite the Shield, not a Vic Mackey exactly, but closer to Vic Mackey than Andy Sipowicz, right? And when I read about this character in the first 4 or 5 books, I was like, he's a jerk. I hate him. And then when I read his book, I was like, oh, I get it. I see. I kind of like this guy. I'm on it. I'm enjoying this. And now I'm read this last one where he interacts with this character. I'm like, oh, I hate that guy. He's a jerk. And so that's just good writing where you can see the different perspectives of these different characters, and it evokes a different sort of response to the same characters. It's something that doesn't really happen in my River City series, for example, because very seldom do you get such an in-depth view of different characters from these other characters, if that makes sense. So Colin's a fantastic writer. You can't go wrong with the classics if you want to read Joseph Wambaugh's books. They're dated in terms of the setting and some of the things that occur, but they're not dated in some of the emotions that go along with that at all. And he's still writing. And so people think about the Choir Boys, or they think about the New Centurions or the Blue Knight, back in the 70s, but he's been writing since then too. And so if you read his Hollywood Station books, they're much more updated, and they're good books.
I also feel it's good to go back to the old books though too, because I feel like a lot of people forget that. So like I was born in 91. I'm a child in a lot of ways. I barely remember 2000 anything prior to 2001. Like I remember going to visit my dad was a federal agent in Boston. I remember I used to be able to go into the O'Neill Federal Building with my dad. Like it would be nothing. Like, oh, okay, I'm just spend lunch with my dad inside the office. Mm-hmm. And then that stopped because of 9/11. Mm-hmm. And then the next time I think I got out of the military was the last time that I visited him in the office before we retired. And I went through a complete full, I had my military ID on me, so I was able to get Wade, and the guy knew me because he knew my dad. So I got brushed through security a lot quicker, but even still, it was like going through TSA. And I'm like, I just remember going through the side door when I was a kid. So I think it's also interesting to go back to those old books because it shows how far we've come and a lot of the bumps along the way.
And what hasn't changed, some things that haven't changed. Another series I'll mention that I found interesting was Webb Griffin wrote a series called the Badge of Honor series. And the interesting thing about that I enjoyed and that I kind of took a little bit of inspiration from in my own work is he tells a very vertically layered story. And so, you're going to get the police officers and the detectives, but you also get the sergeants, lieutenants, the captains, the chiefs, the mayors. And so you get that varied perspective. And I believe he's passed on, but I'm pretty sure his son has continued to write some of those. And there's a good 5, 7, maybe more in that series that are real good. I would also just say, take a chance. I mean, there's so many good independent authors and small press authors out there. Like Michael Connelly is a great writer, but he puts out a book or 2 a year at the most. So if you're reading more than that, try somebody else, right? Don't just wait around for the next Michael Connelly or go reread some of his earlier works. Because as good as that is, there are other writers out there that are good too. And I think he would tell you the same thing. And because writers tend to be very supportive of one another. I have good friends like Eric Beetner, who is a vastly underrated author. People who, if you just start dipping your toe into the crime fiction genre, you'll real quickly come across some writers that you may not be familiar with, give them a shot. Give some of the other classics a shot. The Parker series, and I mean the Donald Westlake one, with Parker the Thief, and it's the other guy, Grohl. Shoot, I can't remember the other character's name. All my friends are going to tease me about this. I'm having a senior moment. I'm not even eligible for the senior discount yet. But a spinoff character from the Parker series, who was the actor. Anyway, the point being, there's a ton out there, and give it a try. And if you're not into reading, on the computer or on your device, get a paperback. If you're not into reading but you're into listening, get an audiobook. Your library you can get it through the Overdrive app, and you can listen for free to audiobooks that they have. I always have an audiobook going, sometimes several, depending on what kind of mood I'm in addition to podcasts. And then, a bedside book, one on the Kindle, one so I can grab on my phone if I'm stuck somewhere. There's so many options for the readers now in terms of how to read. And then there's so many options out there of what to read. The only other thing I would say is give everybody a chance, dive in, try it. And if you don't like it, don't be afraid to quit. I mean, nobody says you have to read a book through to its bitter end. I quit doing that years ago. As a writer, I'm responsible to grab your attention pretty quickly. If I don't do that, put my book down.
Yeah,
that's what I do.
I have to be honest, though. Like, this is one thing I'm feeling always ashamed of, because I do like the crime novel. I have never finished The Maltese Falcon. I have started it 7 times, got halfway through it for some reason. Like, I just stopped it. Like, I'm going to come back to it.
But
never do it, then I restart it.
Sometimes a book just doesn't resonate with people. I mean,
Yeah.
I have people who are really good supporters of my work, who are fans, essentially, right? Readers who are excited when the new book comes out, whatever series it is or whatever. But there are books that I've written that they'll read and they'll be like, I didn't really like that one. My dad, who's one of my biggest supporters, I mean, I wrote this, I created and edited and wrote some episodes for this series called A Grifter's Song, which is an episodic novella anthology series where every episode is written by a different author in a different setting with a different self-contained mystery con, but there's also an overarching tale as well. And, I mean, I always give my new books to my dad when I go up and see him. And I gave him that one. Next time I came back, I'm like, hey, did you read The Grifter's Song? And he's like, yeah, I didn't really dig it. It's just not my thing. I don't like con stories. I'm not into them. Maybe you're not into The Maltese Falcon. I mean, not everything's for everybody. I don't think people should feel bad about not wanting, something isn't your cup of tea. There's lots of other flavors of tea out there, man. Just pour another cup and try that instead.
Exactly. And it's great that you talk about audiobooks, because audiobooks were a lifesaver for me throughout college. Like, my entire dissertation, I was listening to books, because you're on the car, you're driving, you're moving, you're at the gym. You were very fortunate with your books, though, to get a great reader for your audiobooks.
Yeah, the River City books were published by an audiobook publisher called Books in Motion, and they are actually based in Spokane, so it was kind of a hometown setup, hometown author, hometown publisher, set in a thinly veiled Spokane, so it kind of came together nicely. And Michael Bowen is the narrator. I get a little bit of a Peter Coyote vibe from him when I listen to him, but I don't know if everybody does. But he's done a spectacular job across the whole series. The 6th one is in production now, so he will hopefully be doing that one. It does make a big difference when you have a good narrator. They can really bring things to life.
Because there's a few books that I've read in paper form, and I want to switch on audible to get on it, and they just had horrible readers, and I'm like, it just takes you out of it.
But the reverse is true as well, though. I mean, sometimes a book that maybe you're struggling with can come to life when you listen to it on audio. So, and some, just like some books are written in a way that maybe translate better to the screen, whether the small screen or the big screen. I think some books are translate better to audio than others.
No, it's great that you make that mention. The first book I can remember that I had to read the book Life After Death by Adrian Eccles, I believe. He was a guy that was he was part of the West Memphis 3, those 3 young kids that were put on death row for that murder that they had nothing to do with. And he wrote a book while he was on death row. And it was required reading for my undergrad. And I could not get through it. But luckily I found his audiobook that was read by him.
Oh, wow.
Totally different. Like, because he knew where to stop. He knew where his phrases were. It was, he writes very conversationalist, which isn't always translate well on paper.
Right. And it's nonfiction, so I think that's easier for an author to narrate themselves. I have 3 short story collections so far, publishing a 4th here later this year, and 2 of them have been produced in audio, and both of them by professional narrators. Sharon Bond did Dead Even, and Craig Jessen did No Good Deed. They did a fantastic job, and I mean, they're professional actors. But because of the way the marketplace is, and because it's a short story collection, I feel like I can stretch a little bit. I'm actually recording, producing, and narrating the 3rd one, The Cleaner, myself, and it's an education. I can tell you that. And anybody that eventually listens to it, I say up front in the introduction, I'm not a voice actor. You're not going to get that caliber of reading. Hopefully, you're here to enjoy the novelty of having, the author read his or her own work. And the one nice thing about it, I guess, is I knew what I meant when I wrote that phrase, whatever it is. I knew which word the emphasis was on. I knew how snarky it was, or how sad it was, or whatever. So while I might not do as good a job of presenting it as a voice actor, it will be at least accurate in terms of my intent. So we'll see how that goes.
I just have one last question for you, and then I have a question from the audience. One of my writer friends wants me to ask. But sure. I've always wanted to know, because from your point of view as a professor, a law enforcement officer, and an author, and you've also got the chance to interview a few people that have written graphic novels, how do you feel that graphic novels are like influencing society nowadays? Because it's really interesting. I grew up with DC because DC was king in like 90s and early 2000s before DC bought out Marvel was bought by Disney. But like, it's just interesting how you look at it. You have the perfect Boy Scout of Superman who's limited by his own morals, and then you have literally the most gone bad rogue vigilante cop you could ever think of, Batman, and like we hero him. I was wondering your view on like how that affects society.
I wish my co-author Colin were here, because his interaction with comics is far more than mine. He was super into them as a younger man, and as an adult, collected a bunch of them. He's an expert on them. I'm very, very, very far down that ladder, but I do enjoy them. I do enjoy, one of the things I liked when I went to my first Comic-Con at Rose City was the graphic novel panels, and talking to some of the artists that put some books together. I love a well-done graphic novel. I think one of the nice things about comics is kind of the same nice thing about sci-fi or fantasy, but particularly sci-fi and crime fiction. And that is that the medium really allows you to explore some concepts that maybe people might be resistive to if they were presented in a different format or in a different context. You and I were talking before the show how Star Trek did that a lot, both the original series and the Next Generation really explored some social issues in a slightly veiled way, sometimes a little less so, sometimes a little more so, but people were less resistive because of the context. And so I think it does have an impact, and I think it is a great opportunity. It is an interesting dichotomy that you bring up, the Superman versus Batman sort of dichotomy. I think if you'd asked me at certain times in my life, I would have been on the Superman side. But if you ask me what I enjoy more, Batman is far more compelling, I think, and far more fun.
I think Batman has the best. It's a kind of weird, like me as a DC fan, I find Batman boring. I love his offshoots. I love like Nightwing. I love like Jason Todd, who becomes the Red Hood, who basically does that. He has better villains, and I've always found his villains to be very real.
He's just a dude, right? He's just a guy. I mean, granted, he's a super guy, pun intended, but he's just a guy with some gadgets and a whole lot of heart. And Superman's a superhero, literally. He has superpowers. And I don't know, I'm not dissing on Superman or whatever, but I'm definitely come down the Batman camp in terms of what I enjoy watching or reading about. I mean, I've read the Batman Year One and the Dark Knight Returns and these other graphic novels, The Killing Joke, a couple different versions of that. I think they're just great. I mean, I've even played the Batman Arkham Asylum and the video games because they are compelling characters, like you said. I've never read a Superman graphic novel, never played a Superman video game if there is one, and I don't rewatch ever any Superman movies. So I think that's more about how exciting it is as opposed to necessarily the moral implications of it. But I'm sure there's some implicit bias there.
Well, the
too.
reason I ask is just because like I did make the mention that like my generation doesn't seem to care too much for crime novels, but we care about comics. And the thing like a lot of people forget is DC literally stands for Detective Comics. Like they are supposed to be more short and more little illustrated. And it is interesting too how I never would wanted to bring up the comparison how you said with crime novels and sci-fi, because I feel like people would go heresy against me, but it is all a thought experiment. Like that's all the stuff is. It's a one giant thought experiment, and one is less veiled, like in crime novels, and one is more veiled, such as science fiction, where you can bring out some really important issues, especially when you're dealing with sci-fi. You can bring up racism because it isn't dealing with humans.
Yeah, it's xenophobia, right?
Yeah.
It's alienism instead of racism.
The last question I had is one of my writer friends wanted me to ask, how do you feel about, as a crime novelist, about the whole entire trope of the cop that leaves the department and like has to go save the world like all by himself? And
yeah, there's a whole slew of police and detective tropes that some of which I'm guilty of partaking in.
They're there.
Readily admit to falling prey to them, even if I know that their stereotypes are not accurate or whatever. I think that you can, I think you're better off staying closer to something real because, for one thing, the tropes, most of them are well-trod territory that's been well-trodden. And so, when does a trope become a cliche? It's a hop, skip, and a jump. It's not a long journey. And so if you can find ways to, I had a spinoff of my River City series, an officer that encounters something in the second book and ends up leaving the department. And I've written 3 kind of PI noirish, hard-boiled sort of novels with that character. And yeah, he had a drinking problem. He had a problem with the pills. He got injured on the job and he had a pretty huge traumatic event occur. And so it's realistic that he would be involved in that. But you don't want to go too far down that road where you have the alcoholic cop who is the only one who knows anything, who has a captain that yells at him all the time, and dame walks in with legs all the way up to forever. And, all these tropes, they get to be too much. And I think it's more interesting to take somebody that's closer to a real person and having a real experience and exploring that. I don't know if that answers the question.
No, it is. I just always find it like the other thing though, whenever people always ask like my view of tropes, because like I'm just a reader, like I have never written anything in my life besides like an article or a thing. But tropes are there for a reason. They sell. Like they're compelling. Yeah. Like James Bond always goes up against an extremely rich psychopath with a bunch of money and gadgets. Q gives him some weird car and thing, and he gets the girl. You always know what's going to happen.
Yeah, and I will say that I came to understand that we need to find the balance in accepting some of those tropes, but not being prey to those tropes. Sorry about that.
That's fine.
When I spoke to one of my friends who's a romance author, and I told her, the one thing I don't like about romance is what puts me off a little bit is that there are rules. It's not even as a reader. I could never write it because there's rules. You got to do this. You got to do that. You got to do this and this. And she said, don't look at them as rules. Look at them as promises. Like if somebody picks up a romance novel, they expect certain things. They want certain things. They want certain tropes to be explored. Mm-hmm. And if you don't like this trope, then read this subgenre because it's not there. It's a different trope that gets embraced in this subgenre. If you don't like the grizzled cop who does it, whatever, that whole thing, read a cozy where it's actually your grandmother or your aunt or whatever. If you don't like that, read a police procedural where it's a different trope that gets explored. There's plenty of room to explore within all of the different subgenres. And so I guess, those promises to the reader are kind of important because you don't want to pick up police procedural and find yourself reading a science fiction story or a fantasy or something like that either, do you?
But I thought it'd be important to go into tropes because it's trying to get more people into crime novels. And I think it's important that we look at media as these thought experiments on these issues, is that not all crime books are the same. And I feel like a lot of people get that, like all fantasy is the same. All fantasy is Lord of the Rings. All crime is... And like, I feel like we need to get away from that.
Yep. I agree.
Do you have any final thoughts? Do you have any last things you want to say about the book? Or
But hey, it's coming out 11/23, Code 4 by Colin Conway and Frank Zafiro. I hope you pick it up and enjoy the series. Like I said, I've written over 30 books, so if you like one thing, there's always more for you to read. And the nice thing about if you start reading my stuff, that'll introduce you to Colin and his stuff. That'll introduce you to Eric Beetner and other people I've written with. And there's a lot of lily pads you can skip on and across to discover new writers that you might enjoy.
all right, well, thank you so much for being on. We had a great conversation. Thanks for being on Rights and Wrongs. And if anyone else wants to be on Rights and Wrongs, message me. If you want to find out more about Frank Zafiro and his works, just visit his website and you'll find everything there.
FrankZafiro.com.
Thank you.
Thanks, George.
Frank had to rush off, but if you enjoyed listening to him, he also runs his own podcast called Wrong Place, Right Crime, right as in writer. He also has his own website at frankzafiro.com where you can find all his books and other works. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider supporting us. There's multiple different ways you can donate on the website, www.rightsandwrongspodcast.com. We also have a store where you can get some cool merch such as hats, mugs, and stickers. We also do have a Patreon. The Patreon is Right and Wrongs Pod on Patreon. That has a few benefits such as getting on the Discord server so you can talk with me and other people, or get some discounts if you want to buy some merch. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed today's podcast.